Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our weekly live stream. I'm Daniella Young, TEDx speaker, author, and the host of Culture Hacking with Daniella Young, coming soon. Stay tuned for next year. This is that Cabinets HR weekly live stream where once a week we do a deep dive into a topic of culture and then chat with you about it. So to read the actual article, check out our blog at www.cavnesshrblog.com. And let's chat. This week, our blog post is about cognitive bias, socialization, and how we can reach out to women. And so I was reading this interesting article, which was talking all about the line, all men are created equal, written obviously in the United States Constitution, part of what an entire country and therefore entire culture was based on. And of course, the fact that it is unchanging, so it is still used today, still very much, of course, reinforcing the notion that all men are created equal. And the author made an interesting point in the article, which I loved, was that at the time when this was written, it truly was believed that men were created equal, and men, and of course, even not all men in those days, but that men were equal and women were a different level. Women didn't get the right to vote, didn't get a lot of things for a very, very long time afterwards. And it's interesting that in 2009, we tend to kind of think that we've arrived, we're there, we've achieved gender parity. And in fact, there's still so much influence that those words have over many, many different things. And, all it takes is to look at the data, and you can see that women enroll and graduate into universities at numbers that are usually higher than men, certain universities obviously notwithstanding, but the ratio only goes up in favor of men as people climb the career ladders. We often refer to this as a pipeline problem, when in fact they're just, when we refer to it as a pipeline problem, we say there just aren't the right kinds of women. But instead of actually looking into and really kind of digging into the effects of cognitive bias and the way that it affects us, men and women, like we're all affected by these cognitive biases. And rather than it being a true pipeline problem, it's usually the issue of who raises their hands more, which is men, all studies show, versus who's acting with a lot more caution, which, by the way, is this survival mechanism that women have developed over generations and millennia of needing survival mechanisms to operate in the world. And so I've been thinking about this recently, and I wrote about it this week because of the podcast that I mentioned that I'm starting, right? Culture Hacking with Daniella Young. This is part of my brand. This is on par with the book that I'm writing, a lot of the stuff that I'm doing now. And the idea is pretty simple. The idea is I talk to all kinds of people and I get them to tell me their life story, their journey, and then how that birthed various culture insights, different perspective into different issues, pretty much no rules, no regulations, just talking to people. But of course, as a thinker that does a lot of thinking about diversity and someone who's trying to learn actively about socialization and culture and my own biases and my own sort of unconscious things that I do and things that influence me, not to mention the way that all interacts in the world. And as, of course, a woman, Hispanic, military veteran, someone that's in some of these diversity categories in the first place, it was important to me, and it is important to me, that my guests run the range, right? The full gamut of American society. And I track, men, women, where they're from, what race they are, immigrants, different diversity, want to have foreigners, want to have all this different stuff, like a true representation of the American population. And so I put out this call for guests on, let's say LinkedIn, right? A couple different platforms, but LinkedIn was a big one, where it's just like my place to go to find business professionals. And in my call for speakers, I, said, okay, I want to talk to anyone, like here's the concept, but I'm specifically looking right now for historically marginalized voices. So I'm looking for women, I'm looking for people of color, I'm looking for LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, and a couple of other categories that I threw out. And I still got mostly white men that applied. And of course, the reason that I did my call that way was because I already had some guests and it was still trending white men. And this is not anything bad. This is just, at least what I realized and what I believe to be true, is that it wasn't anything bad. And it certainly isn't that, you know, these men are more qualified or these men have more to say. It was just that these men are volunteering themselves. So I kind of realized that, you know, I'm not going to throw in the towel here. I'm going to go to some women's only platforms. And I did that. You know, I'm fortunate enough to be part of several groups with strong women, with thinking women and writers. And, you know, interestingly enough, many of these groups have to be secret and hidden just so that they can have their very existence not attacked, almost as if the very idea that we sometimes need our own space where we're not overshadowed by other people is important. So I put out this call for speakers in the women's only group. And of course, I immediately got flooded. I got so many great women. I had to put so many other people on a wait list, which was really cool and exciting for me. And, you know, I've also noticed now in my tracker, the challenge is, while I'm still going after diversity, I still have majority Caucasians. So the next step is going to be to find the places where some of the people of color are hanging out and the disabled people are hanging out, and some of these other groups that I know I want to speak to. I know they're going to add and be very important for the conversation, but by myself not being a member of those groups, I need to do more work to find those people where they are at. And so as I've been thinking about this and reading about this and looking around, and you know, obviously there's a lot of writing about socialization, and there's specifically a lot of writing about how women themselves can overcome this, how women can lean in, press forward, raise their hands. I've been an activist in the veteran community for many years now, and we focus very intensely on why women themselves don't step forward, what it is, how we can encourage women to self-identify. And I'm starting to realize that sometimes I think we forget to take a look at the actual cultural messaging around that, for example, female veterans receive at every turn, which can be messaging that is so male dominated that we appear to just be an afterthought if we're even thought of at all. And if you don't believe me, check out the recent Marine Corps video that made national news, and not in a good way, because in 8 minutes of airtime in 2019, it included exactly 6 seconds of women. So today I wanted to focus my tips and tricks not about how women can overcome the pipeline problem, the gender gap, or raise their hands more. I wanted to focus it on how well-meaning people in positions of power can find the women, even those women that aren't raising their own hands yet, or that are not ready to draw attention to themselves and share their expertise in the world, but still have it there and still are more than ready to walk through a door as long as it is open for them. Just a reminder, you know, we talk about this kind of a lot on these various live streams about unconscious bias, but it almost feels impossible to talk about any of these issues without offending someone. And so if I do, of course, I'm sorry, that's not my intention. I like to really put in the disclaimer here that unconscious bias isn't anyone's fault. It's a result of thousands and thousands of cultural images, social messaging, not to mention hundreds of thousands of years of our culture affecting us. But I do truly believe that there's a lot that we can do as individuals or as individual organizations to bring unconscious bias to a conscious level. And then once we realize it and accept it, then we can start attacking it. So while we all these days accept the idea that all human beings are created equal, we do need to acknowledge and accept the idea that we all don't move through the world with the same level of equality. And so this is the way we can kind of begin to frame our actions and conversations and thoughts in different ways to hopefully achieve this equality and this diversity and these multiple perspectives in the future. So here are my weekly tips on how you as a business leader, business owner, individual in a position of power, or what have you, can reach out to women and find talented women to bring them into your pipeline. And so the first is to make your job ads, your calls for talent, or the literature that represents your company, right? So your website, the flyers you hand out, etc., women friendly. And funny, I guess, comment I like to say when business leaders and clients of mine ask me for advice on how to attract more women, I challenge them to host events that attract more women. And it is a bit of a complex issue, but it's also simple. And it's, realizing that, as I said before, we walk through the world differently. We notice things differently. We are socialized differently. And so we respond to different things. If you keep doing weekly after-hour happy hours where junior people in your company can meet mentors and those aren't attracting women, it doesn't immediately mean women are not interested in mentoring. It might mean you need to try lunch meetings or breakfast meetings, try a different approach, and also you can ask the women what they want. The answers that I always get when I ask specific groups of people that I'm not a member of, like, how would I appeal to you? Or what am I doing wrong here that's unconsciously messaging what I'm not intending to mention? And I ask this with openness and without judgment. It's astounding, the responses that you get and the things you just never would have thought of. Because there's so much in wording and subliminal message and presentation that is the traditional way things have always been done. And it's messaging to women specifically that this is not the place for them. And quite frankly, I believe that if you're not a woman, or even a woman that spent time thinking about these things, you just probably can't see it yet. And that's, of course, why it's called unconscious bias. So before you do your next ad campaign or write that job description, find a bunch of women, crowdsource it to them, ask them with openness if there's anything unintentional in your messaging. Number 2 is find the women's spaces. I talked a little bit about that in my own search for podcast guests. And this goes along with hosting things in a way that attract women. Like, we as women, we don't hang out online or in person as the same space as the men. And a lot of the messaging is that we need to go find those spaces. And yes, that's true. But if and culture in the future hopefully will be different. But if you right now want to change, want to find the qualified women, find the places where the women are hanging out. We also sometimes just need safe zones, right? Where we can be us. And so we can approach this in a lot of different ways. Tip number 3 is call on women even when they don't raise their hands. And this is something, there's been a lot of writing on by thought leaders where they notice themselves doing it. And then they ask for comments, they ask for questions, and only men raise their hands. And so only men get to be the ones that are called on. And this seems obvious, of course, that women should just raise their hands more. But sometimes we just don't. Studies show that women apply to jobs that they only apply when they feel they're over 80% qualified for everything on that list, whereas men will apply when 20% of the qualifications meet them. There's an inherent confidence that we've learned through socialization, and women are still playing catch up. My personal experience, I was graduating in 2009 from college, and I was top ranked in my university. And that was it. I was just graduating with honors until the dean called me and asked me, Daniella, why have I not seen your application to speak at graduation? And, I ended up being the one that got selected to speak at graduation. And that's something that's kind of become an achievement point for me. It's in my bio, right? I was the college valedictorian. It's one of those things that I talk about, but I also realize that I never would have been if I hadn't been invited into that. Step number 4 is take sexual harassment at all levels seriously. There is nothing too small, and it seems like it goes without saying in this day and age, but I don't think it does yet. Almost every single woman that I know in a professional setting has been the victim of comments, barbs, jabs, flirtations, jokes, It's almost funny to me when I go to the VA hospital and they ask if you've ever experienced sexual harassment in your career in the military, because I can't imagine a woman who hasn't. And a lot of times it's seen as jokes, seen as locker room talk, boys being boys, or this is the reason why women shouldn't be here. And they're not small concerns. They are, again, like real reasons, a big reason why women don't stay in the workforce at the same rate as men, and why specifically in the historically male-dominated industry, even when women do enter, they leave at a much higher rate than they leave other careers. And so, again, this is a very much longer-term cultural thing that will hopefully change in the future. But for now, if you're a business leader that is wondering what is going on, take a look at how these things are interacting in your company. And number 5 is promote your current female talent into positions of power. Putting women on your leadership team, in your leadership positions, on your outreach team is a huge, huge, huge part of how you get more women to apply and raise their hands and go into those situations. And, it's uncomfortable to be the only person in the room that looks like you. I'm convinced, no matter who you are, that is true. And I'll never forget this time I was in Afghanistan with 43 of my peers. We were the first group of women that was being trained for deliberate combat missions with all male units. And every single man that came in to talk to that room of women, even men that were like priests or Muslim religious leaders, like people whose job it was to talk in front of people for a living, mentioned how nerve-wracking it was to speak to a room full of women. Every single one of them. And in that moment, I had this realization why I, even as an experienced speaker at the time, why I was so nervous as a briefing officer, because as a U.S. officer, almost every time I was the one speaking, I was one of the only women in the room. And it was unconsciously affecting me until I became conscious of it. And then I noticed it all the time. And so, having women in the room and having women having a seat at the table is not only something that's good for those women, good for your company, good for the different perspectives, but it is good also for addressing that pipeline problem. And so often, part of the pipeline problem is the pipeline itself, and we have to break the pipeline before we can get to where all of the talent can just flow freely. So, most importantly, last but not least, I'm glad you're watching this. I'm glad you're thinking about unconscious bias, because until we know that there's a problem, we can't actually try to solve the problem. And that's the important part. It's so important to be able to have these open and honest conversations about these topics without feeling attacked or put upon. And suffice it to say, I am, of course, a woman, not a man. And so if I was in any way unconsciously offensive in this, I would love to hear about it and hear how I can think differently and do things better in the future. We'd love to hear any and all feedback that you have on this article or on our conversations. Thank you again so much for joining us today. I am Daniella Mestenek-Young, TEDx speaker, author, combat veteran, and co-founder at Cavness HR. Cavness HR is a virtual HR company. We are changing the way that small businesses interact with HR. So if you want to learn more, please come check us out at www.cavnesshr.com. You can tune in on Facebook every Tuesday for a live discussion of a blog topic, and you can follow me on Twitter for more of everything. Thanks so much, and remember to be great.